The velvet curtains caught fire, turning Lady Elia's world into a suffocating cage of orange light and piercing screams. One moment, she had been tracing the gilded embroidery of her cushions, lost in the hollow, rhythmic clacking of the carriage wheels against the silver pass. The next, the thrum of 100 bowstrings shattered the morning. A single flaming arrow hissed through the silk window hangings, missing her throat by a heartbeat to bury its head in the mahogany paneling. The scent of lavender and expensive wood was instantly replaced by the abrasive, choking stench of burning oil and scorched velvet. "Ronan," she shrieked, her voice thin and fragile against the sudden, monstrous roar of the flames. Outside, the world had descended into a visceral cacophony of steel and slaughter. The rhythmic clatter of her ducal escort, men she had known since childhood, was gone, replaced by the wet, heavy thuds of falling bodies and the predatory snarls of an unwashed, faceless swarm. Elia pressed her palms against the glass of the door, her high-collared, blood-red silk gown blooming like a fresh wound against the dark blue interior of the carriage. She felt the heavy vehicle lurch and heave as the lead horses were cut down in their traces, their agonized cries harmonizing with the whistling of more arrows. The carriage skidded, the wheels screaming against the rocky lip of the ravine, and for a terrifying second, Elia felt the sickening weightlessness of a world about to tilt into the abyss. The whiplash of the moment was absolute. The carriage, which for weeks had been her opulent, candlelit sanctuary from a world she feared, was now a claustrophobic death trap. The air inside grew thin and searingly hot as the fire climbed the exterior panels, licking at the roof. But then, above the roar of the inferno, the roof groaned under a sudden, heavy weight. Through the smoke-fogged skylight, she saw him. Duke Ronan did not call for a retreat. He did not look for a path to escape the carnage. He stood atop the rocking, burning carriage like a titan forged from blackened steel plate. His charcoal-gray cloak whipped behind him in the freezing mountain wind, a tattered banner of defiance against the gray, muddy sky. He was the focal point of the chaos, the only thing in the silver pass that seemed solid as the world dissolved into ash. The transition from the terrifying, airless heat of the cabin to the sudden, freezing blast of the silver pass wind happened in an instant as Ronan reached down and ripped the carriage door from its hinges with a screech of tortured metal. He didn't look like the refined nobleman who had walked her through palace gardens. He looked like a demon birthed from the wreckage, his set jaw streaked with grit and his eyes locked onto the V formation of bandits closing in from the tree line. "Give me your hand," he roared, his voice stripped of all courtly polish, raw and commandingly desperate. As Elia reached out, her fingers disappearing into the cold, hard grip of his gauntlet, the carriage gave a final, terminal lurch. Ronan hauled her upward, his muscles straining against the rivets of his armor, and pulled her onto the roof just as the interior became a furnace. They stood together for a heartbeat on the precipice, a vulnerable royal in ruined red silk and a relentless protector in battle-worn plate. The bandits were no longer a distant threat. They were a sea of steel, surging forward with the predatory confidence of wolves who had cornered their prey. They were unwashed, armored in mismatched leather and stolen chainmail, their faces contorted in battle cries that were drowned out by the wind. They moved in a tightening wedge, designed to overwhelm the lone duke by sheer, suffocating numbers. Ronan looked at the swarm, then back at Elia. There was no time for tactics, no room for a measured defense. He reached for his broadsword, a massive, double-edged blade that had served his family for generations. As he drew it, the steel caught the licking flames from the roof, the heat of the carriage fire transferring to the metal until the blade glowed with an intense, vengeful orange light. It became a secondary sun in the gloomy pass, illuminating the desperation in his eyes. "Stay behind me," he whispered, though the wind carried it to her as if he had shouted it. "Do not look back." With a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ravine, Duke Ronan took his leap of faith. He did not wait for the bandits to reach the carriage. He launched himself from the roof, a falling star of blackened iron and living fire. He dived directly into the heart of the V formation, his glowing sword carving a brilliant, searing arc through the mist. The impact was visceral. Elia watched, her breath hitching in her throat, as Ronan hit the muddy ground and instantly transformed into a whirlwind of violence. He was a man pushed to his absolute limit, risking everything, his title, his life, his very soul to buy her a single minute of safety. He was a lone shield against a tidal wave of steel, his broadsword hissing as it met the cold rain and the hot blood of his enemies. As he disappeared into the swarm, the carriage beneath Elia began to groan again, the wood charring and the structure failing. She stood alone on the burning roof, the fire at her heels and the Duke at her feet, realizing that the rhythmic peace of her old life was gone forever. The world was orange, the world was screaming, and the only path forward was through the sea of fire that Ronan was carving out of the mud. He was the relentless protector, and she was the reason he refused to fall. Even as the bandits surged over him, he rose again and again, his flaming sword a defiant lighthouse in the dark, reminding her that as long as he breathed, the swarm would never reach her. The sky was falling in sparks and shadow, but in the center of the storm, the Duke rode alone, and he was enough. The sky was no longer a vast, indifferent blue, but a falling canopy of ash, iron, and screaming wind. As Duke Ronan plummeted from the roof of the carriage, the world seemed to contract into a singular, breathless moment of descent. The air rushed past his blackened visor with a hollow, haunting whistle, and for a heartbeat, he was weightless, a ghost in plate armor suspended between a burning past and a bloody future. Below him, the bandit swarm was a roiling sea of mismatched leather and rusted chainmail, their predatory snarls quickly turning to masks of pale, wide-eyed shock as they realized the prey was falling upon them like a thunderbolt. He hit the muddy ground with a bone-jarring thud that vibrated through his very marrow. The sheer kinetic force of his descent crushed the two men directly beneath him, their breath leaving them in a wet, final gasp. Without a moment's hesitation, Ronan surged upward from the mire, his body a coiled spring of lethal intent. As he rose, he drew his broadsword in a massive, sweeping arc. The heavy steel had drank the heat from the carriage's inferno, and now the blade glowed with a vengeful, intense orange light, hissing as it met the freezing mountain mist. He was no longer a man, he was a falling star of iron and fire, a secondary sun illuminating the grit and sweat etched into his set jaw. Back, he roared, the sound echoing off the narrow, jagged walls of the Silver Pass like a clap of thunder. The bandits, emboldened by their overwhelming numbers, attempted to close their V formation, but Ronan met them with a relentless, rhythmic brutality that defied mortal endurance. He was a whirlwind of blackened steel, his charcoal-gray cloak billowing behind him like the tattered wings of a vengeful angel. Each swing of his glowing sword left a shimmering trail of embers in the air, the heat of the blade cauterizing the very mist he moved through. He did not fight with the practiced, cold grace of a palace duelist. He fought with the desperate, jagged aggression of a man who had already bargained his soul for a few more minutes of the lady's life. Behind him, the carriage groaned, a wounded, opulent beast of blue and gold. The flames had taken a ravenous hold of the rear wheels, the wood snapping and popping like bone. The screams of the dying horses, cut down in their traces, added a haunting, dissonant soprano to the percussion of clashing blades and the rhythmic grunt of exertion. Through the shattered, soot-streaked window of the tilting vehicle, he caught a fleeting, heart-wrenching glimpse of red silk. Elia. She was pressed against the interior, her hands white-knuckled against the mahogany frame, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She wasn't just a political pawn or a wedding prize. She was the only light left in his world of shadow, and the sight of her terror fueled a fresh wave of ferocity in his veins. A mercenary leader, a man scarred by a dozen border wars and clad in a stolen captain's cuirass, swung a heavy mace at Ronan's head. The Duke caught the blow on his vambrace, the screech of metal on metal sparking white against the orange gloom of the ravine. With a guttural snarl, Ronan drove his shoulder into the man's chest, the force of the impact sending the bandit reeling back into his own ranks. But for every mercenary he felled, two more seemed to emerge from the treeline, their contorted faces lit by the carriage's pyre. The V swarm was closing in, the faceless threat realizing that the Duke stood alone, his guard decimated and his back to a burning wall. Ronan's breath came in ragged, burning gasps, his lungs straining against the weight of his cuirass. He could feel the searing heat of the carriage at his back, a constant, blistering reminder that the sanctuary he was defending was rapidly becoming a funeral pyre. He took a half-step back, his heavy boots slipping in the gore-slicked mud, and raised his flaming sword one more time. The glowing blade caught the light of the setting sun and the rising fire, a defiant beacon in the center of the slaughter. He was the relentless protector, the lone shield between the woman he loved and an endless, cold night. As the sky continued to fall in sparks and shadow, he prepared to give the earth the only thing he had left to offer, a sacrifice of blood and iron. The bandits hesitated for a fraction of a second, intimidated by the sheer, suicidal radiance of the man before them. Ronan did not give them the chance to find their courage. He stepped forward into the sea of steel, his sword carving a path through the darkness. A man pushed beyond his absolute limit, ensuring that even if the sky fell, it would not touch the woman behind him. The sudden, agonizing shriek of the carriage's main axle snapping was the sound of a world finally shattering. The opulent vehicle, once a gilded sanctuary of blue velvet and gold leaf, groaned as it reached its breaking point, the wood splintering with the force of a lightning strike. With a violent, bone-jarring lurch, the carriage rolled onto its side, sliding toward the precipice of the ravine. Inside, Elia felt the gravity vanish, her world spinning into a frantic blur of blood-red silk, shattered crystal, and suffocating smoke. When the motion finally ceased, the whiplash was absolute. The rhythmic, high-octane roar of the ambush, the clashing steel, the whistling arrows, the Duke's defiant battle cries, was replaced by a terrifying, ringing silence, broken only by the hungry crackle of flames devouring the upholstery. Elia lay pinned against the door, her breath hitched in a throat choked with the abrasive stench of singed hair and gunpowder. The transition from the frantic heat of the fight to this frozen, suspended moment felt like a physical blow. Then the heavy door above her was ripped upward with a screech of tortured metal that set her teeth on edge. A gauntleted hand, blackened by soot and slicked with a dark, viscous moisture that she knew was not oil, reached down through the swirling embers. "Elia, give me your hand, now." Ronan's voice was raw, stripped of every ounce of ducal polish, a desperate command that bypassed her shock. He looked less like a nobleman and more like a demon birthed from the heart of the carnage. His blackened steel armor was gouged with deep silver scars, his charcoal-gray cloak was half-shredded, and his face was a map of crimson streaks and silver sweat. Elia reached up, her trembling fingers disappearing into the cold, unyielding grip of his glove. With a heave that strained the very rivets of his cuirass, Ronan hauled her upward, dragging her through the jagged teeth of the broken window frame just as the fire licked at her heels. They hit the ground hard, and the whiplash of the environment was even more brutal than the crash. They moved instantly from the suffocating, candlelit heat of the carriage interior into the bone-chilling, freezing mud of the Silver Pass. The mountain air was a needle-sharp shock to her lungs, and the mountain slush seeped into her thin silk gown, the hem turning heavy and brown as it drank from the gore-stained earth. She gasped, her knees sinking into the mire, her royal dignity dissolving into the freezing slush of the battlefield. "We have to move," Ronan hissed, his eyes scanning the treeline where the V-swarm was regrouping, their silhouettes flickering against the mist. He did not wait for her to find her footing. He hooked a powerful arm around her waist, half carrying and half dragging her away from the burning wreckage. They had not made it 20 paces when the fire reached the hidden gunpowder stores intended for the wedding flares. The explosion was not a sound, but a concussive wave of heat that threw them both forward into the muck. Elia felt the spray of mud and splinters pelt her back as a pillar of orange fire reached for the dark sky, turning the blue and gold carriage into a blackened, skeletal ruin. The prestige of her station, the political union she had been sold for, and the safety she had always taken for granted died in that blast. Lying face down in the freezing mud, Elia felt the cold seep into her bones, but it was the heat of Ronan's body as he shielded her from the falling debris that anchored her to the world. There was no lady and no duke in this gutter of the pass, only two survivors painted in the same crimson mud, shivering in the shadow of the ravine. Ronan rolled onto his knees, his flaming sword now extinguished by the mire, leaving only the dull, battle-worn iron. He looked at her, his jaw set, and for the first time, the Relentless Protector allowed a flicker of pure, unadulterated terror to cross his features. It was a terror not for his own life, but for the broken princess in his arms, and in that shared moment of filth and fire, the barrier between their worlds began to bleed away. The sanctuary they found was a shallow, weeping grotto, hidden behind a heavy veil of frozen ivy and ancient stone. Inside, the air was stagnant and smelled of damp earth, providing a sharp, suffocating contrast to the biting mountain wind that still carried the distant, haunting notes of the hunting horns. As they collapsed into the deepest shadows, the adrenaline that had fueled their frantic flight evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, bone-deep agony. The transition from the movement of the hunt to the stillness of the cave was a physical blow, a sudden awareness of just how close they had come to the end. Ronan leaned against the damp cave wall, his legs finally giving way under the crushing weight of his blackened plate. The heavy, metallic thud of his armor hitting the stone echoed through the small space like a funeral bell. In the dim, filtered moonlight that managed to pierce the ivy, Elia saw the true, staggering cost of their escape. The Duke's left side was drenched. His dark tunic was no longer charcoal gray, but a shimmering, wet purple. Blood leaked steadily from a jagged breach in the steel where a bandit's spear had found the vulnerable gap in his plate during the leap from the carriage. His breathing was shallow and forced, a wet rattle that terrified her more than the baying hounds in the woods. "You're dying," she whispered, her voice trembling as she crawled toward him on hands and knees through the dirt. "I am holding the line," Ronan gasped, his head lolling back against the rock. His set jaw remained firm, a stubborn mask of duty, but his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were beginning to haze over with the grey film of shock. Elia didn't ask for permission. She reached for the hem of her gown, the high-collared, blood-red silk that had been hand-stitched by the finest tailors in the capital for a wedding that was supposed to secure a kingdom. With a violent, desperate yank, the expensive fabric shrieked as it tore. She ripped a long, wide strip from the skirt, the silk shimmering like a river of rubies in the gloom, its royal prestige now reduced to a common bandage. She moved into his personal space, a sacred boundary she had never dared to cross in the months he had stood as a silent, iron shadow at her door. To reach the wound, she had to unbuckle the heavy leather straps of his cuirass. Her fingers fumbled with the cold, gore-slicked buckles, her hands shaking so violently that Ronan had to reach out, covering her small, pale hands with his massive, scarred palm. The touch was electric, a collision of steel and skin that bypassed every courtly protocol they had ever lived by. "Elia," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull the very air from her lungs. For a singular, suspended moment, the hunt outside ceased to exist. The barrier of his blackened steel and her royal silk had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, visceral reality of two people fighting for one another. She pulled the armor aside, exposing the brutal reality of his torn flesh. Without hesitation, she pressed the red silk against the wound. Ronan groaned, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain that he tried to swallow, his fingers tightening instinctively on her shoulder as he braced himself against the sting. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. She leaned in, wrapping the red silk around his waist, her arms encircling him as if in an intimate embrace. The proximity was overwhelming. The scent of wood smoke, cold iron, and the salt of his sweat filled her senses. As she pulled the knot tight, her forehead rested for a fleeting second against his collarbone. She could feel the frantic, heavy thud of his heart slowing, synchronizing with the rhythm of her own. The Duke, the Relentless Protector, who had been nothing but a lethal weapon in her service, reached up with a trembling, bare hand and brushed a stray, muddy lock of hair from her face. His touch was feather-light, a question he didn't dare ask, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in their world. In that small, dark space, the noblewoman and the soldier vanished. They were just two heartbeats in the dark, bound together by a strip of red silk, and the terrifying, beautiful realization that they were no longer fighting just for the realm, but for the person holding them together. The silence of the grotto was broken by a sharp, rhythmic snapping of twigs just outside the ivy veil, a sound that cut through the intimate air like a blade. Ronan's hand instantly clamped over Elia's mouth, his other hand flying to the hilt of his sword with a muscle memory that defied his massive blood loss. They sat frozen, lungs burning with the effort of silence, as a single, limping figure stumbled past their hiding spot. The intruder was a bandit, separated from the main swarm, clutching a shattered arm and coughing with a wet, ragged sound that spoke of internal ruin. He didn't make it far. He collapsed just paces from the cave entrance, the life fleeing him in the cold, silver light of the moon. Ronan waited, his body a coiled spring of tension before he eased himself up. Every movement was a grueling battle against the red silk binding his side, but his face had returned to that mask of cold, hard flint. "Stay here," he breathed, a command that brooked no argument, though his eyes lingered on hers for a second longer than a protector's should. He slipped out into the mist, a shadow returning to the night. Elia watched from the darkness of the cave, her heart hammering against her ribs as he rolled the dead man over with the toe of his boot. She saw Ronan stiffen, his entire posture turning rigid and brittle, as if he had been struck by a second spear. Curiosity and a rising, cold dread overrode her sense of safety. She crept out from behind the ivy, her tattered red gown trailing through the frost like a path of blood. "Ronan, what is it?" she whispered, the mountain air biting at her exposed skin. The Duke didn't answer. He was staring down at the man's mismatched leather armor. Pinned to the bandit's chest, partially obscured by a cloak of common, flea-bitten wool, was a silver brooch. It wasn't the crude, hammered trophy of a thief. It was a sunburst intertwined with a serpent, polished and heavy, the ancient, unmistakable crest of the House of Valerius. Ronan's own family crest. The Duke reached down and ripped the silver from the dead man's tunic, his gauntlet shrieking against the metal with a sound of pure agony. He held it up to the moon, his hand trembling with a silent, murderous rage that seemed to radiate from his very armor. This wasn't a random act of border violence or a hungry pack of scavengers. This was a state-sponsored execution, a betrayal woven into the very fabric of his lineage. The mercenaries hadn't just known the route. They had been paid with the very gold Ronan had spent his life defending. "My brother," Ronan whispered, the words tasting like ash and poison in his mouth. "He didn't just want the title. He wanted the war. He wanted you dead to ensure the peace would never hold." The revelation hit Elia with the force of a physical blow. The political union, her long journey, the wedding that was supposed to save her people, it had all been a target painted on her back by the people Ronan called kin. The V formation of the bandits wasn't just a tactic. It was a signature, a family trait of calculated, ruthless efficiency. The betrayal turned the freezing air of the Silver Pass into something even more lethal than the steel they had fled. Ronan looked at the brooch, then at Elia, the realization dawning that they weren't just fleeing an army, but a legacy of blood. The man who had lived his life as a shield for his family now held the proof that the hand holding the shield had been bitten by the very mouth it fed. In the hollow silence of the pass, the crest shimmered with a sickly light. Ronan's fingers closed around the silver sunburst, crushing the delicate metal in his fist until the edges drew blood from his palm. He looked back toward the path they had traveled, his eyes twin pits of fire. The Relentless Protector was no longer just guarding a lady, he was hunting a traitor. But as his knees buckled slightly, the red silk around his waist darkening with fresh exertion, Elia realized that the brand of betrayal was a wound no bandage could ever truly heal. The cold had finally begun to win. Back inside the shallow grotto, the fire that had sustained Duke Ronan's spirit flickered and died, replaced by the dull, glazed stare of a man sliding into the abyss. The revelation of his brother's betrayal, the silver sunburst of the House of Valerius crushed in his palm, had been the final weight his spirit could carry. With a heavy, metallic groan that sounded like the death of a kingdom, his knees buckled. The Relentless Protector collapsed into the dirt, his head hitting the stone with a sickening thud, and his hand, which had gripped his broadsword with such lethal intent for years, went limp. The blackened steel clattered onto the frozen earth, a discarded relic of a fallen god. "Ronan," Elia cried, dropping to her knees and pulling his heavy, armored head into her lap. His skin was no longer flushed with the heat of battle or the sting of betrayal. It was as cold as the frost creeping over the cave floor. The red silk binding his side was completely saturated, a dark, heavy maroon that felt like ice against her skin. She pressed her ear to his chest, hearing the frantic, erratic skipping of a heart that was running out of fuel. Outside, the world was closing in. The hunting horns had stopped their mournful drones, replaced by the rhythmic, terrifying crunch of many boots on frozen snow and the low, guttural barks of the hounds. The V-swarm was no longer searching. They were sweeping, their line of torches creating a wall of fire that moved steadily toward their hiding spot. Elia looked down at the Duke's sword. It lay there in the mire, a massive scarred length of iron that looked far too heavy for her slender arms. She looked at her hands, hands that had only ever known the softness of embroidery, the weight of fine jewels, and the cold ink of treaties. She was a passenger, a prize to be guarded, a lady in red meant to be saved and bartered. But as she heard the low, predatory whistles of the mercenaries echoing just beyond the ivy veil, a new, sharp clarity cut through her terror. The transition was absolute. The girl who had screamed in the burning carriage was dying, and something harder was being forged in the dark. If she hid in the back of the cave, they would eventually find her. They would drag her out into the light, execute the unconscious man who had given his lifeblood for her, and she would become a ghost in a war started by his own kin. She would be a victim of the very peace she was supposed to represent. She reached out and gripped the hilt of the broadsword. The leather wrap was still warm from Ronan's hand, a ghost of his strength lingering in the grip. It was agonizingly heavy, a physical manifestation of the burden he had carried alone. With a strained, guttural sob of exertion, she hauled the blade toward her, the tip scraping against the stone with a sound of sharpening steel. She didn't have his plate armor or his years of training, but she had the red silk of her gown wrapped around his wounds, and she had the fire of a woman who refused to be a footnote in a traitor's history. The orange glow of a torch flickered against the ivy. A shadow stretched across the cave floor, a long, distorted shape of a man holding a spear. Elia stood, her tattered red gown swaying in the freezing draft like a tattered battle flag. She didn't retreat into the darkness. She stepped forward, the heavy sword held in a trembling, two-handed grip, the point leveled at the entrance. The protector was down, but the lady was standing guard. As the first bandit pushed through the ivy, his eyes widening at the sight of the blood-stained girl standing over the fallen titan, Elia felt the cold embers of Ronan's fire ignite in her own veins. She wasn't just hiding anymore, she was waiting to strike. The ivy veil shivered, the frozen leaves clicking together like skeletal teeth as the first flickers of torchlight bled into the cave. Elia could hear the heavy, wet breathing of the men outside, the sounds of the V-swarm growing louder, more rhythmic, the sound of a closing trap. She looked down at Ronan. He was a ghost in blackened steel, his chest barely rising, his lifeblood still weeping into the red silk of her gown. He could not fight, and if they found him like this, he would be slaughtered in his sleep, a lion executed in a den of wolves. A desperate, jagged plan ignited in her mind, a flicker of the same cold strategy that lived in Ronan's eyes. The bandits were looking for a duke and his ward. They were looking for the silhouette of the protector. The Iron Man who had carved a path through their ranks at the pass. They were hunting a legend, not a girl in a ruined dress. With trembling hands and a strength born of pure, unadulterated terror, Elia began to strip the armor from Ronan's unconscious form. The leather straps were stubborn, slick with frozen gore and mud, but she worked with a frantic, silent speed. She pulled the heavy, blackened pauldrons from his shoulders and unbuckled the breastplate, the metal feeling like ice against her palms. She didn't put the armor on, she couldn't move under its crushing weight, but she dragged the pieces toward the secondary opening at the rear of the grotto, a narrow fissure that led upward into a thicket of tangled briars and mountain mist. She propped the blackened cuirass against a jagged stump just outside the rear exit, wedging the greaves into the soft earth to give it height. She draped Ronan's tattered, charcoal-gray cloak over the metal, letting the heavy fabric fall in broad, imposing folds. In the deceptive, flickering moonlight and the thickening fog, it created a perfect, hollow silhouette of a man standing guard, a silent sentinel watching the ridge. She took a heavy branch and wedged it into the sleeve of the cloak, letting the tip of a discarded dagger's hilt peek out like the pummel of a broadsword. Over there, by the ridge, the shadow, a voice barked from the forest, raw with the hunger of the hunt. The hunting horns erupted in a triumphant, discordant blast that shook the frost from the trees. The hounds, catching the scent of the blood-stained cloak and the metallic tang of the armor, let out a chorus of frenzied, high-pitched baying. Elia scrambled back into the deepest shadows of the cave, her breath coming in shallow, silent hitches that burned her throat. She watched through the ivy as the orange glow of the torches swerved violently away from the main entrance, drawn like moths to the dark, silent shape she had built in the mist. "It's him, the Duke is making for the heights," another shouted, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a dozen pairs of boots racing over the frozen ground, moving away from their hiding spot and toward the decay on the cliffside. The hounds surged past the cave entrance, a blur of fur and gnashing teeth, their predatory focus locked onto the shadow on the ridge. Elia collapsed against the damp cave wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had bought them minutes, perhaps an hour, but the deception was a fragile thing, a ghost story told in steel and cloth. As the sounds of the pursuit faded into the higher crags of the Silver Pass, she turned back to the man in the dirt. He was stripped of his iron shell, vulnerable and pale in his blood-stained linen undershirt, no longer a god of war, but a man who had nearly died to keep her breathing. She crawled to his side, pulling the remains of her red silk gown over his shivering frame to keep out the killing frost. Waiting for the moment, the hounds realized they were hunting a shadow while the prize lay hidden in the earth. The transition from the brink of death back to the world of the living was a slow, agonizing crawl through a fog of iron and ice. When Duke Ronan finally opened his eyes, the first thing he felt was not the warmth of safety, but the shocking, weightless absence of his armor. For a moment, he believed he was already a ghost. He felt exposed, stripped of the blackened shell that had defined him since his first campaign, yet he was wrapped in a strange, fragrant warmth. Beneath him was the hard earth of the grotto, but over him lay the tattered, blood-stained remnants of red silk, Elia's gown, still carrying the faint, defiant scent of lavender amidst the smell of damp stone. He tried to sit up, a jagged groan catching in his throat as the wound in his side flared with a rhythmic, white-hot ache. His hand instinctively swept the dirt for the hilt of his broadsword, but his fingers met only cold dust. The panic of a failed protector surged through him, a cold spike of adrenaline that cleared the grey haze from his mind. "Don't move, Ronan. You'll tear the silk, and I've already ruined enough of it for one lifetime." The voice was soft, but it carried a razor-edged authority he had never heard from the woman he had spent months guarding. Ronan turned his head, squinting against the dim, watery morning light filtering through the frozen ivy. He froze, his heart skipping a beat for a reason that had nothing to do with blood loss. Elia was standing near the mouth of the cave, silhouetted against the mist. She was no longer the porcelain bride of the Silver Pass. Her red gown had been hacked off at the knees to allow for movement. Her slender arms were smeared with soot and wood ash, and in her hands she gripped a heavy, iron-cranked crossbow she must have scavenged from the bandit he had felled near the entrance. Beyond the cave, the mist was thick, but Ronan could hear the rhythmic, metallic clink of gear. The V-swarm had returned. They had found the empty shell of his armor on the ridge and realized they had been hunting a phantom. Now they were funneling into the narrow, funnel-like approach of the grotto. But they weren't rushing, they were walking with the cautious, bunched-up stride of men who expected a trap. Ronan watched, mesmerized and horrified, as Elia signaled with a sharp, piercing whistle, a sound he had taught her for the hounds during their long journey, now turned into a command for war. Above the cave entrance, a precariously balanced pile of boulders and charred carriage debris, rigged with the remains of his own leather armor straps and lengths of torn silk, groaned and gave way. It wasn't a random landslide, it was a surgical strike. The screams of the mercenaries erupted through the ravine, as the throat of the pass was suddenly choked with falling stone and splintered mahogany, cutting the swarm in half and trapping the vanguard in a killing zone of their own making. "Elia, stop," Ronan rasped, his voice a broken whisper as he struggled to his knees, his hand clutching the red silk at his side to stem the fresh bloom of heat. "You have to run while they're distracted. I'll hold them. I'll give you the time." "No," she said, turning to look at him. Her eyes were not the eyes of a ward or a lady-in-waiting. They were bright with a fierce, terrifying clarity that mirrored his own. She didn't look at him as a master looks at a servant or as a victim looks at a savior. She looked at him as an equal. "You have spent your whole life preparing to die for me, Ronan. You've treated your life as a currency to be spent on my safety. But today, I am choosing for us to live." She stepped to the very edge of the ivy veil and leveled the crossbow with a steady, practiced breath. The whiplash of the moment hit him harder than any mace or spear ever could. The man who believed his only value was as a shield, a hollow piece of steel meant to be battered, and eventually broken, felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his martyr complex shatter. He had been a weapon for so long that he had forgotten that a weapon is only as strong as the hand that wields it, and Elia's hand was steady, her resolve forged in the same fire that had consumed their carriage. He realized, with a surge of emotion that burned hotter and deeper than the carriage fire, that he didn't have to be a sacrifice to be a hero. He didn't have to die to save her, because she was busy saving them both. The barrier of duty that had kept him at a distance dissolved in the cold mountain air. With a grunt of renewed, visceral purpose, Ronan reached for a jagged shard of stone. Using it to pull himself to his feet, he stood tall, stripped of his blackened plate, but draped in her red silk, ready to fight not as a martyr or a shadow, but as a man with a future worth defending. The hounds were at the door, but for the first time, the Protector wasn't alone. The Ravine of Fire was no longer a place of ambush, but a crucible of their shared making. As the remains of the bandits' swarm scrambled over the debris of the rockslide, they found themselves funneled into a narrow corridor of jagged stone and rising heat. The wreckage of the carriage still smoldered at the base of the pass, sending thick, oily plumes of smoke into the dawn sky, creating a shifting curtain of grey and orange. Duke Ronan, standing tall in his linen undershirt with the red silk binding his core, gripped his recovered broadsword with a hand that no longer trembled. Beside him stood Elia, the crossbow leveled, her gaze tracking the movement in the mist with the icy precision of a seasoned scout. "They are coming," she whispered, the sound barely a breath against the freezing wind. "Let them," Ronan replied, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "They expect a dying man and a weeping girl. Give them the fire instead." As the first of the mercenaries broke through the smoke, Elia loosed the bolt. It whistled through the air, finding the gap in a brigand's gorget with lethal accuracy. Before the man had even hit the mud, Ronan surged forward. He didn't fight with the reckless abandon of a martyr seeking an end. He fought with a measured, brutal efficiency, moving in a deadly dance that left openings for Elia's follow-up shots. When a bandit lunged at Ronan's unprotected side, Elia didn't scream. She dropped the empty crossbow and swung a heavy, discarded mace, shattering the man's knee and allowing Ronan to deliver the finishing blow. They moved as a single entity, a rhythmic synergy of steel and silk. The V formation of the enemy was useless here, broken by the terrain and the psychological shock of a lady who fought like a fury. The ravine became a furnace of their defiance. Ronan's blade, once again catching the embers from the smoldering wreckage, carved arcs of orange light through the gloom, while Elia coordinated their movements, her voice ringing out commands that turned the narrow pass into a slaughterhouse for their betrayers. The final mercenary, seeing his brothers-in-arms decimated by the pair, turned to flee toward the tree line, but he didn't make it 3 steps before the sheer exhaustion of the swarm's morale collapsed. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the ragged, synchronized breathing of the 2 survivors. Ronan turned to Elia, his face streaked with soot and blood, looking at the tattered remains of her red gown. He didn't offer a hand to lead her. Instead, he held out his arm as a comrade would. From the shadows of the tree line, 2 of the escort's surviving horses emerged, riderless and spooked, but unharmed. They mounted the horses as the sun finally broke over the peaks of the Silver Pass, casting a long, golden light over the path toward the border. There would be no wedding to stranger, no political surrender to traitorous brother, and no more silent shadows between them. As they rode toward the horizon, the blackened steel and the red silk were indistinguishable from the mud of the road. They didn't ride as a duke and his lady, bound by the rigid hierarchies of a dying world. They rode as equals, 2 souls forged in the fire of the ravine, finally free to write a story that belonged to no one but themselves.